Ronald Lawson was born in 1940 in Sydney, Australia. He earned a BA in history and a PhD in sociology from the University of Queensland, completing his studies in 1970. After finishing his dissertation, he moved to New York City, where he spent nearly 40 years in social research. He taught sociology at Hunter College during the 1970s, then shifted to Queens College in the City University of New York for the rest of his career, retiring in 2009. As a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church himself, he has spent much of his career applying the general principles of the sociology of religion through an insider's perspective to this particular religious group. As an insider, he has been able to get closer to the people in his religion and obtain more detailed information than most scholars of religion can manage. He has looked in particular at whether we should consider Adventism to be a sect or a denomination in various societies around the world. European scholars of religion like Troeltsch found the concepts of church and sect useful for describing the rise of pockets of disagreement with and opposition to the once dominant Roman Catholic Church in their countries. That church had exercised monolithic control over issues of morality, good versus evil, and even religious control over the secular power of kings and emperors for many centuries. Against the background of this monolithic power, the idea of sects appearing as small isolated groups in opposition to one feature or another of the established church accurately described the historical situation for those scholars. But this picture had to be modified when scholars in the United States looked around and tried to make sense of the religious landscape in their new country. In the first place, the Constitutional Compromise at the founding of the United States adopted the Pennsylvania model and created a barrier forbidding the secular state to favor any one religious group or doctrine over another. So the United States has never experienced a universal state-sponsored church in the European sense of that word. Without this side of the conceptual coin, the idea of a small oppositional sect also required modification. Whenever some new religious idea or group springs up from the American soil, it is not automatically forced to take a hostile, oppositional stance against some established state church, because there isn't any such monolith to oppose. In consequence, religious research in the United States has developed a special affinity for a new concept, the idea of a religious denomination. Like many other writers, Lawson puts this concept to work in his study of how one particular religious group has been changing over the decades. But what exactly is a denomination if it is not a church in the real European sense, and also not a sect? As a kind of halfway house between church and sect, a denomination exhibits some of the features of both of these traditional opposites. First of all, a denomination often can take an accommodating rather than a hostile oppositional attitude towards a society around it. Since there is no state church looking down from the halls of power, every denomination can assume that the secular government and the society on which it is built will tolerate whatever doctrines and practices its believers follow. No denomination is forced to be defensive, so that sect-like aspect is missing. Since each denomination is free to preach and teach and organize as it wants, these denominations also can become quite large when there is no state church to suppress or persecute them. Sociologists also understand that whenever any kind of organization becomes large and successful in this way, inevitably it must become more formal and hierarchical in order to coordinate all of its many members and activities. This is just part of the price of success. On the other hand, no denomination in the United States is allowed to take on airs and claim universal authority over the morality of the nation. No denomination can become a church in the European sense, because it is not allowed to swallow up the secular government and use that state power to persecute other groups and enforce its own doctrines and practices on the whole population. Without the option of such a monopoly on religious life, every denomination has to come to terms somehow with the existence of all the other denominations around it. For most of the mainline denominations in the United States, such as Presbyterians, Methodists, Lutherans, Episcopalians, and even Roman Catholics themselves, this reckoning leads to compromise, tolerance, and coexistence. An excellent example of this coexistence can be observed at many colleges and universities, where several different mainline Protestant denominations often band together as a matter of practical efficiency to provide a physical space and social schedule of activities as a religious home away from home for young adults on campus. These shared campus ministries demonstrate the cooperative rather than oppositional aspect of denominations. Lawson himself is a lifelong member of the Seventh-day Adventist religious group, so he is in a particularly good insider position to examine his group with respect to these concepts of church, sect, and denomination. As he informs us already with the title of his article, he sees a process of change or evolution happening within the Adventist group, which he describes as a gradual shift starting from sect-like origins towards denominational status, and then possibly back again in the other direction. The Seventh-day Adventist religious community certainly illustrates how, when a new group appears on the religious scene, it often exhibits sect-like features. William Miller, born shortly after the American Revolution, grew up about 200 years ago in New England and fought for his country against the British in the War of 1812. But after the war, back on his farm, like most Americans at that time, he got more and more interested in religion. He assembled what he interpreted as many clues in the Bible, and by the early 1830s, he concluded that the world was going to end with the second coming of Christ, sometime in late 1843 or early 1844. With only a decade to get ready, he began to preach fervently about the second coming and quickly attracted a very large following numbering into the millions. When Christ did not actually come again by the end of 1844, Miller became a figure of ridicule and died 5 years later. But many of his followers had taken to heart this idea of the second advent of Christ, and some of them kept this basic orientation, but without a specific calendar date. They also insisted that Saturday, not Sunday, should be our day of remembrance because it was on the seventh day of creation that God rested, not the first. So they became known as Seventh-day Adventists. In their earliest years, the Seventh-day Adventists had a number of special beliefs that set them apart from most of American society. In addition to Saturday worship, their strong focus on the Bible led them, like many other Bible-centered groups, to regard some features of ordinary American society, such as Christmas trees, non-religious holidays, and other non-biblical beliefs and practices, as dangerous and wicked. Their emphasis on health as a sign of correct Christian living led to questioning some aspects of medical practice. At first, these Adventists had reservations about the idea, new at that time, of vaccinations against contagious diseases. But over time, Lawson explains, many of these original sect-like aspects have faded out of Seventh-day Adventism. Their official doctrine now allows vaccinations and the celebration of Christmas. The secular world seems less threatening and wicked to them than it once did. In short, the Seventh-day Adventists appear to have evolved over the last century and a half from a sect into a denomination. Although Lawson sketches a long, gradual shift for Seventh-day Adventists from their sect-like origins in the mid-1800s to a more denominational character in the late 1900s, a century and a half later, this is not the main subject of his article. The gradual change towards denominational status is only the background of the picture he paints for us. The characters in the foreground are very different. Talking about his own experience as a Seventh-day Adventist living in New York, he documents a fast, dramatic change that swept through his religion in the last quarter of the 20th century, a change still going on today. To illustrate this change, he used his insider status to collect information on all the Adventist congregations in his region, getting outstanding support from all the ministers and their clerical staff. The response rate for his data collection is better than for most social science survey research, and we can treat his data as quite reliable. He shows that half a century ago, around 1970, most Adventists were native-born Americans, divided into two departments that were composed of mostly white congregations and mostly black congregations. A large majority of the group were white native-born Americans. Now, half a century later, white native-born Americans have become a minority of all Adventists in this same region, below 40% of the total. Their absolute number has hardly changed at all, but what has changed is that the number of Hispanic Adventists has more than doubled, and those of other ethnic backgrounds have also increased rapidly. Adventism has gone from being a mostly white denomination to a complex multi-ethnic religious group. How and why did this happen? Lawson's answer is simple. Since 1970, a new wave of immigration has poured into the United States. Unlike earlier immigration waves that came predominantly from Europe, the largest numbers of immigrants have come from Asia and Latin America, and also from other parts of the world. The percentage of the total American population born outside the United States is now once again as high as it was 100 years ago at the peak of the last wave of immigration that brought many of our ancestors to this country. To an important extent, then, this rise of foreign-born and non-white membership in Adventism is just a reflection of the incoming immigration tide in general. But this rise in membership is not quite a mirror image of that larger immigration flow. Adventist missionaries were active in many parts of the world in the late 20th century and continue to be so today. For this reason, for example, the Adventist immigrants include a larger than average share of members from Jamaica, Haiti, and other Caribbean island nations. Adventism also has grown rapidly in Africa and in Korea. The changing ethnic composition of Seventh-day Adventist congregations is only the beginning of Lawson's story, however. He called his article, "When Immigrants Take Over," but what interests him most are the consequences of that immigrant takeover. As a result of this ethnic shift, he has observed the trend from sect to denomination shifting into reverse, and it provides many examples of a reversion to sect-like attitudes in many congregations, especially those made up of mostly those immigrant members. These congregations put renewed emphasis on old Adventist doctrines from 100 years ago or earlier, such as the judgment that Christmas trees and other non-biblical celebrations must be condemned and avoided, that women should dress according to particular rules of modesty every day and not just in church, and other similar judgments that many of the U.S.-born Adventists of the early 21st century would, in Lawson's own words, find embarrassing. This conservatism and biblical literacy, he says, seems to be aimed primarily at life within each congregation. They are not making an effort to root out Christmas trees from shopping centers and picket around Santa and his photo op sessions there. This also marks a turn back towards sect-like attitudes because it raises a higher wall of judgment between us in the congregation and them in the surrounding society. But the immigrant Adventists also appear to have reserved particular hostility to express against other religious groups rather than the secular state, particularly against the Roman Catholic Church. This hostility harks all the way back to the mid-1800s when Adventists insisted that the Sabbath is the seventh day of the week, or Saturday, and that the Catholics abandoned the Bible when they began to worship on Sunday, a day named for the sun as a pagan object of worship. The Catholics, of course, quote other scripture references right back at them and point out that Saturday is named for Saturn, another potent pagan symbol, and so it goes. But why would immigrants be the instigators of such a reversion back towards sect status for Adventism, when the path to mainstream denomination had seemed to be running so well? Lawson borrows his explanation for this shift, he observes, from the writing of Richard Niebuhr, a Protestant theologian writing in the early 20th century. Niebuhr's best-known book, The Sources of Denominationalism, suggested that people who are converted to a religion after already reaching adulthood must undergo a very dramatic, perhaps even traumatic, reconstruction of their personal identity and beliefs, for which they must invest a tremendous amount of emotional and intellectual energy. Living in a new religion may be a little like riding a bicycle. You must concentrate and keep your momentum going, or you could fall off. Niebuhr thought that adult converts had to keep reinforcing their new faith, so they would be very strict and energetic about defending doctrines and following correct practices. By comparison, if you grow up within a religious community from childhood, all of those doctrines and practices will be so familiar as to be almost automatic, taken for granted. In fact, when you get around to your adolescent rebellion, those very same fundamental religious rules may be things that you start to question at about the same time you realize that your parents are not perfect and infallible, but just ordinary people like everybody else around you. A really earth-shaking revelation. Since most of these immigrant Adventists are also first-generation adult converts, Lawson points out it is not surprising, after all, that they seem to have pushed their congregations back towards more rigid, sect-like positions. But as he points out in his article, Lawson observed that this has created tensions both within and between Adventist congregations themselves. One minister admitted that he didn't know what to do about music in church. No matter what he did, one side or the other would be upset with him. And congregations composed mostly of immigrants from Korea or the Caribbean or Mexico get frustrated when other neighboring congregations of mostly US-born Black or white Adventists don't want to go along with their strict rules in obedience to the old ways taught to them by missionaries in their countries of origin. It's a tricky situation and illustrates very clearly that concepts like sect and denomination are not just categories in a still picture, like tiles of glass in a stained glass window. These concepts describe stages or states along the path of constant adaptation and change followed by any religious group. After the long, gradual transition of American Adventism from sect toward denomination, and then the sudden jog back towards sect status as a result of an immigrant tide of adult converts from other countries, Lawson ends his article with a look forward concerning what he expects to happen next in his religious group. Will the new emphasis on somewhat divisive sect-like doctrines championed by the new immigrant converts steer Adventists in the direction sometimes called an entrenched sect? There are groups such as Jehovah's Witnesses that have defined a stable position for themselves in American society that does not include the sort of gradual accommodation and compromise with other groups that point toward eventual denominational status. Or will the general trend that Lawson observed between the 1840s and the 1970s resume its former direction? A trend toward exactly such accommodation, compromise, and realignment into one denomination among many? The answer to his way of thinking, as well as that of many other scholars, depends on what happens with continued immigration into the United States. The earlier wave of immigration in the late 1800s and early 1900s brought millions of new Americans into the country, and they brought with them a powerful expansion of the Roman Catholic Church, along with additions of new groups like Greek Orthodox, Jewish, and even some Asian religions that came along with the influx of Chinese workers who helped to build the transcontinental railroads through the Rocky Mountains. But that immigrant wave provoked a powerful nativist backlash in the population, as opportunistic politicians whipped up anti-immigrant fears and hostility as a way to build up their own personal careers. In the 1920s, drastic legislation virtually put an end to that wave of migration, and the US-born children of all those immigrants gradually transformed the sectarian tendencies of the immigrant generation towards the denominational mainstream. We may think that we're different from people in the past, more enlightened and more modern, but in fact, people are really just people, and really not that clever or original. The new migration wave of the past 50 years is now generating another nativist backlash in the 2020s, just as happened in the 1920s, and opportunistic politicians are again building up their careers by fanning the flames of fear and hostility. It would not be surprising at all to see a new wave of social controls. Whether or not this happens will have a good deal to do with the possible resumption of a trend toward mainstream denominational status for Seventh-day Adventists. This future will become visible first in the lives of the U.S.-born children of Adventist immigrants. They will show us which direction the group as a whole will move. If additional immigrants continue arriving for several more decades, and if they continue to include a large share of adult converts to Adventism, then the sectarian tendencies of the group may be reinforced and sustained. But this will create generational tensions within congregations as U.S.-born children grow up going to American schools, watching American television, speaking fluent English as their first language, and aspiring to find success in the American economy. If the immigrant stream is reduced to a trickle, then these second-generation children of the original immigrant wave will quickly begin to redefine the religious life in those congregations as they reach adulthood and begin to take leadership positions. Lawson points out one particularly awkward problem faced right now by these new congregations of Adventist immigrants. His data collection showed that virtually all of the pastors serving these congregations were themselves immigrants and adult converts to the faith. This also is nothing new. Every ethnic variety of religious group that has ever immigrated into the United States, from the Irish and the Germans, or the Poles and the Greeks, to the Vietnamese and Hindus from India, usually have preferred to import their religious leaders from the old country. Sometimes those leaders actually led their flock across the ocean to the new promised land. Sometimes the immigrants got here first, but felt acutely the lack of spiritual leadership they had left behind and recruited immigrant pastors to come and join them. But Lawson looks around at the virtually complete dominance of immigrant pastors in congregations of Adventist immigrants and recognizes that these guys, for they are all guys, no women, actually represent one of the strongest sources of sectarian extremism. The dress codes, the hostility to Catholics, and all the rest of it are driven above all by these immigrant pastors from the old country or countries. Lawson sees this as a serious source of future conflict when these guys come up against the rising generation of American-born children in their congregations. Things may not go very well when that happens. One thing he suggests as a way to avoid some of that prospective conflict between generations and conflict between a congregation and its pastor involves concerted efforts to recruit and train new, younger, American-born pastors for Adventist congregations, even congregations with mostly immigrant members. This has its own dangers, as the immigrant generation may begin to feel abandoned and rejected as they grow older, but Lawson clearly seems to prefer this vision of the future, a vision that could even include more examples of female pastors. He seems more comfortable with Adventism as a denomination than with a reversion to its original sectarian place in American life. If this happens, then Seventh-day Adventism may take its place as one strand among many in the mainstream of religion in the United States. But given recent decades of immigration, there will be one interesting difference about an Adventist denomination compared to most of the others. The Lutherans look back to an overwhelming concentration of ethnic origins from Germany and Scandinavia. The Greek Orthodox Church continues to celebrate its distinctive Greek origins and ethnic heritage, even as it also solidifies its position as one denomination among many. Hinduism in America is almost totally concentrated among people with ethnic origins from India. But Adventism will include ethnic groups from many parts of the world. Perhaps the closest parallel for them might be the complex ethnic mosaic that leaders of the Roman Catholic Church must deal with in the United States, juggling traditions of Latin Americans, Catholics from Asia, descendants of Polish, Irish, and many other Catholics. Adventism could develop into a similar multi-ethnic denomination if it goes down that path in the next few decades.